around and change your mind. Just turn around and change your mind. Spinning my web as fast as I can. You keep breaking my home with your head. You are far bigger than me, but you're the one that's scared. I catch what I can. I only eat the things that land in my web. You take what you can and call yourself a grass-fed vegetarian. Say goodbye to the birds and the bees. Say goodbye to the trees. Say goodbye to the homes that you've known as people flood the cities. Well, the birds keep building their nests and the bees keep trying to make honey us. I've been spinning my web as fast as I can, but you keep breaking my home with your head.
And welcome to OMSI's Virtual Science Pub. My name is Andrew Haight, and I'm the Director of Guest Engagement at OMSI. I will be your host tonight. I'm very excited to learn more about mushrooms. Before we get started, I have a couple things to tell you about happening at OMSI these days. We are committed to sparking curiosity and igniting enlightenment. To help everyone at home, we've crafted and curated all sorts of engaging science activities and experiments to inspire you to experience the wonder of science from wherever you are. Visit omsi.edu for more information and resources. And if you do any of the science experiences and activities, please send us photos or videos, so that we can see how great a scientist you are. I also hope that you enjoyed tonight's pre-pub trivia and music by local Portland artist Strange and the Familiars. They will be playing a live concert in OMSI's Planetarium at some point in 2021. Putting on these live shows takes a lot of work, and we have an amazing partner that helps us make this happen. Big thank you and shout out to Celestream for providing the live streaming services for tonight's Science Pub. We really appreciate their support. OMSI's Body Worlds exhibit just closed, and we're preparing for our next exhibition, The Life and Legacy of Genghis Khan. This exhibit will immerse visitors in the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. It opens October 24th. In the meantime, you can tour the USS Blueback, visit our Natural Sciences Hall, or enjoy a show in the planetarium, where we have recently upgraded the HVAC system to include an ionization system. Advance tickets are required for all of these experiences. Please check out our website for more information and see how OMSI is following the state guidelines to keep our guests and staff safe. And guess what? There's something you can do to support your local community. We have some outstanding food and beverage partners, and I would encourage you to put the pub back in Science Pub Experience. So go ahead and order some delicious food and tasty beverages from one of our partners from around the state. Tonight's schedule will be very familiar to anyone who's a regular Science Pub attendee. And for those of you who don't know what a regular Science Pub looks like, we are going to begin with a little mushroom-themed trivia game that is a warm-up for tonight's talk. So grab a pen and some paper, and so you can participate at home. After that, we'll have a 60-minute lecture by Peter McCoy. After the Q&A, you can submit your questions at any point during the lecture via the for the Q&A, rather, you can submit your questions at any point during the lecture via the comments in our live feed. We will collect them along the way, and after the lecture, I will ask your questions to the speaker. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture, please consider making a donation or purchasing a Science Pub pint glass. Don't worry, there's no pressure to donate. Our mission at OMSI is to inspire curiosity by creating engaging science learning experiences for all people of all backgrounds, ages. So sit back, relax, and get ready for a great lecture right after our trivia. So here's our trivia. And Abby Putnam is going to be joining us to play along live. She's an educator in our early childhood experiences area. So please give a warm welcome to Abby. Hello, Abby.
Hello.
Great to see you. What are you most excited about for tonight's lecture?
Oh, well, I love mushrooms. I'm always scared of picking mushrooms because I don't want to pick the bad ones. But I think that the way that mushrooms and people have kind of co-evolved and used each other throughout the years is pretty awesome. Very cool.
Nice. Yeah, I'm excited about so many aspects of the talk. So let's get started with our trivia. If you're at home, grab a pen or pencil and some paper so you can play with your family or whomever it is that you might be watching along with tonight. I suggest you can even make it a little interesting, you know, play for bragging rights, see who's going to do the dishes next, take the garbage out, all that good stuff to make it fun. So there are 10 multiple choice questions. I'll read a question, give you some time to guess, and then reveal the answer before moving on to the next. Abby, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Right, let's do this. So, what is the approximate number of fungal species in the world? A, 150,000, B, 1.5 million, C, 2.3 million, or D, 5.1 million?
Wow. Well, I am sure that scientists haven't described them all, so it has to be a big number. And I'm seeing like such variety of the fungus. It's probably the highest number, but I'm gonna guess C, 2.3 million, because it's the most interesting number.
Find out. Oh, there you go. Nice one. I like how your justification was most interesting number. I'd like to know what is not interesting number, Abby. Okay, on to our next one. How old is the earliest evidence of human mushroom consumption? 6,700 years ago, 11,100 years ago, 18,900 years ago, and 43,000 years ago.
Whoa. How do they even figure that out?
Maybe Peter can tell us in his presentation.
Yeah. I mean, like, we don't have recorded history, so it has to be. I have no idea. Okay, let's go with that interesting number again with C, 18,900 years ago.
Good. I think we're also being challenged to be able to say big numbers out loud.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, you did it! Yeah, all right! So, anthropologists studied the teeth of prehistoric woman named Red Lady, who was found in the Almiron cave in eastern Cantabria, Spain. The plaque showed signs of plant pollen in several mushroom spores, and its earliest evidence for humans eating mushrooms yet discovered.
Wow.
Cool.
Cool.
All right, number 3. What is the product economically important? What is the most economically important? What is the most economically important fungal product? Gosh. Most economically important fungal product. Ethanol, citric acid, wild mushrooms, A and B, or none of the above?
Well, that's a good question because I didn't know that mushrooms made ethanol. But citric acid, I think I knew came from like a mold. And then wild mushrooms like truffles, those are really expensive. So is it just like really expensive or widely used being economically important? I guess I'll try D and find out if ethanol comes from mushrooms.
D. Hey, 3 for 3, Abby.
Nice.
Good one. All right, moving on. Number 4. How long have humans been cultivating mushrooms? A, 350 years, B, 1,000 years, C, 1,400 years, or D, 2,300 years?
I think that they've probably been doing it for quite a while because someone came up with all kinds of crazy stuff like yeast and beer and things like that a long time ago. So let's go with D, 2,300 years ago.
Yeah. Ooh, that one, I missed that one also. The historical records of intentionally cultivated mushrooms have been reported recently. It is indicated that the first mushroom cultivated was around 600 AD in China, 1,400 years. Okay, number 5. How many mating types or sexes are there in mushrooms? How many mating types or sexes are there in mushrooms? 102, 2,450, 8,300, or 23,000 mating types?
I did not realize that. I knew plants had crazy things with their genetics, but interesting number, B?
B.
2,000.
B, going with the interesting number, B.
Oh my God!
23,000 mating types.
What?
The hairy fan-shaped fungus, Schizophyllum, commune boasts more than 23,000 mating types. Though its more intricate reproductive strategy means that not every type can mate with every other. That is wow. There's a lot to learn there, I think. All right, so number 6. Which movie prominently features mushrooms? A, A Trip to the Moon. B, Nausicaa Valley of the Wind. C, Super Mario Brothers. D, all of the above, or E, none of the above.
Okay, so Super Mario's obviously has like mushrooms. A Trip to the Moon, though, I've seen that, and they all are kind of creepy looking, but that was a while ago. So I'll just go with C, but it might be D.
Prominently features mushrooms.
Let's
find out.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the above. I don't know Nausicaa Valley of the Wind, so yeah. Interesting. All right, number 7. How far does the average wild mushroom spore travel after being released? 1 inch, 3 feet, 1 mile, or 10 miles?
1 mile?
1 mile?
1 mile? That seems like reasonable.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I should have given you more of a hint there.
That makes more sense. You usually see them all in bunches. But.
Yeah, 3 feet or 1 meter is how far a mushroom spore typically travels.
Right.
Number 8, death cap. Amanita phalaeotes is the most poisonous mushroom on Earth. It is mistaken for a commonly eaten mushroom, the portobello, paddy straw mushroom, chanterelle, or button mushroom.
Well, this fuzzy photograph kind of looks like, the small one looks like a button.
Mm-hmm.
Chanterelles are yellowy, I think, which the top is kind of yellowy. I've never seen a paddy straw mushroom. I don't think it's portobello. Maybe it's a paddy straw mushroom.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, I think I'll try paddy straw.
All right. Final answer?
Sure.
Oh! Yeah! So the Amanita phalaeotes, known commonly as the death cap mushroom, causes life-threatening hepatorenal dysfunction when ingested. Considered the most poisonous mushroom in the world, it contains amoxicillin, amatoxins, that are responsible for 90% of global mushroom-related fatalities. One cap is sufficient to cause death in an adult.
That's why you got to go mushroom picking with a pro.
Yeah, that's the truth. Number 9, true or false? Fungi cannot only survive, they can thrive in space.
Sure.
True.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, look at that. True. Fungi plagues near because, in general, the microbes that thrive inside space shuttles and space stations like to feast on decayed human flesh.
Ooh.
Or to put it more politely, have served as ecological mechanisms for decomposition of dead skin cells, which astronauts cannot help but shed over long journeys.
Thanks, mushroom.
Yeah, doing their part. Okay, last one. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
10. The Letoporus is an edible mushroom that tastes just like beef, pine nuts, chicken, or cheese.
My brother went mushroom hunting when I was younger, and he brought home something called like chicken of the woods. So I'm gonna guess chicken C, but I don't know if that's what that is.
Chicken C. Yeah. Letoporus gilbertsoni is commonly known as chicken of the woods mushroom because its remarkable resemblance to chicken meat when cooked properly. Also, people think it tastes like chicken.
Doesn't everything?
That's awesome. I lost track, Abby. I think you did a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, good work. And now we're going to hear a little bit more about our presenter's bio. So, Peter McCoy is the founder of Mycologos, a Portland-based mycology. Oh, here we go. Portland-based mycology school and experimental mushroom farm, the Fungi Farm Festival, and the grassroots mycology advocacy organization, Radical Mycology. In 2016, Peter published Radical Mycology, a treatise on seeing and working with fungi, a 650-page book on mushroom cultivation, ethnomycology, and much more. The book has since been hailed as one of the most important and accessible texts in the science and art of mycology, offering unique and cutting-edge insights into the rapidly evolving field. Peter's work has been featured in the New Yorker, Grist, Vice, and Salon. He has shared his unique approach to mycology with numerous of science, art, and mycology societies around the world. The Portland native, Peter is an artist, writer, musician, and community organizer. Take it away, Peter.
Right on. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be at OMSI Science Pub as a Portland native. It's kind of a little bit of a dream come true. So thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to dive into the information. There's definitely a lot I'm going to try to get across in an hour. Mycology is a huge topic, incredibly fascinating, and there's so many ways to appreciate all that fungi do, from environmental perspectives to the human influences, which is the primary focus of this talk. I'll definitely try to weave in some of the science to keep up with the OMSI science crowd, but definitely want to focus a lot on the human influences, both historical and what's been happening in just the last few years and what we might look towards in the future of humans working with fungi. So let me swap over here, do a little computer magic, and we'll get going. So the first thing to always help out folks that might be new to fungi in general is just explaining what they are and also just why they even matter. When I go out into an environment, the first thing I kind of think about is how are the fungi present and where are they? And when I go to a space like this or see something like this, the way that I see it is that the fungi are everywhere. And this is not just because they're throughout the soil and doing lots of important things there, but actually, as we'll touch on a little later, inside of every single plant and essentially filling all the plants around us and really sculpting the environment in all these ways that researchers have only begun to discover in just the last decade or two. So even just the science of mycology and fungal ecology, kind of seeing fungi out in the world, is rapidly turning some of our natural sciences a little bit on their head and providing new paradigms, new insights into some of the natural cycles and the way the world works. And at the same time, we're revisiting how fungi might have influenced human history, human culture, and again, trying to uncover stones or turn over stones that might have been overlooked by researchers of the past who didn't really think about fungi because they weren't taught to consider them in their education. So what are fungi? Well, 90+% of them, really 99%, as far as we understand, are filamentous. So they're made up of a network of tissue called mycelium. Only about 1% live as a single cell, typically as yeast. The yeast that makes our beer and bread is a great example, but the vast majority live as this network of tissue. This is a high magnification image. All the molds start out like this on your bread and old fruit. Eventually those molds develop colored spores that we can see, whereas the mushroom turns into a more complex form. Mycelium grows as a network at the tips and at the leading edge, as we say, and it's constantly branching and surveying the soil or the wood or the old fruit and grabbing nutrients and water, digesting it externally and absorbing the byproducts. This is what a hyphal tip, one of the individual threads in this network, looks like right at its tip. It's kind of a cool three-dimensional model of it. And a lot of interesting stuff there, biologically, physiologically, a lot of things in the finer details that make fungi really unique compared to plants and animals that for anybody on that, with that type of interest in biology, I definitely recommend checking out. But the mycelium grows, whether it's mold or mushroom, gathering water, gathering nutrients, and eventually forms a structure to spread its spores. Mold we just see as kind of a carpet of colored spores, whereas the mushroom structures itself into this very complex three-dimensional form. And it's really a complex apple on this tree of mycelium, intentionally or ostensibly meant to just spread spores. But it looks great, maybe tastes great if it's edible, maybe helps make you feel better, helps your health. And if nothing else, just looks quite incredible and really complex. And there's a huge diversity in them. So it's really amazing that mycelium even forms these structures, let alone to the extent and range that they do. So this is just some more pictures, some interesting stuff, individual threads up close in the network. And here at the tip, we find a structure called the Spitzenkorper, which is a unique fungal organelle-like thing. It's kind of the brain of every individual thread, navigating, sensing the environment, and dynamically responding at this little thread and this little thread, releasing nutrients, or rather releasing digestive compounds and defense compounds to protect itself because it has no true skin as it glides through the soil, glides through the wood, and then again absorbs the byproducts of its own external digestion. So these are some of the things that separate fungi from plants and animals. On the tree of life, we have the bacteria. They're many numbered and very complex to a good degree. Their cells are fairly simple compared to fungi and animals, but there's many of them. And they also digest externally. But what sets fungi apart is their larger complex cells that we have in common with them. And that places in a group known as eukaryotes. But we know very little about fungi. A good comparison is that alongside the other eukaryotes of plants and animals and fungi, we've only studied just a tiny, tiny percentage. The science is one of the youngest, mycology that is, compared to the other natural sciences. So whereas we think there's roughly 400,000 plants in the world and we've named all but 2% of them, We approximate roughly 2.3 million species, and that's a conservative number at this point. And we've only named about 2%, 2 to 3%. So that's just naming them, let alone understanding their ecological role. And from there, how we as humans can incorporate them into the garden, into agriculture, into other systems we do to make the world a better place, or the way that we operate a little bit more efficient. So again, just our understanding at the basic level is so young. Beyond that, the problem sort of exacerbated by this realization that for every one plant, there's 6 fungi, and yet for every professional mycologist, there's 5 professional botanists. So the science is sort of behind and really needs a lot of people to join it. It's one of the few sciences where the amateur is welcomed and encouraged to join and to shed new light on the many, many questions we have, many unknowns about fungi. So it's a great science to get involved in and to actively and really potentially dramatically contribute to, and in some cases with very little effort, just in the example of naming a new species or surveying the diversity in your own backyard. Some more technical details. So fungi are broken into several subcategories, 7 phyla, as we say. The primary distinction from the plants and animals is, again, they don't photosynthesize and they don't have an internal stomach like animals. Rather, they digest externally and obtain their nutrition. That's one of the easiest ways to sort of separate them from the other eukaryotes. More technical things is they have a compound in their cell wall called ergosterol. It's similar to our cholesterol, but different, and it's unique to fungi. They also, their cell wall is made in large part out of chitin, same stuff that makes up insect exoskeletons. So their tissue is relatively quite strong and tough. And they also store their energy in a special sugar that plants and animals don't really use. You can see the number up top. So the range goes anywhere from, used to be 1.5 million up to 6 million, as some papers have said, but again, roughly 2.3 is the average right now. There's several subcategories, or among the phyla rather. We find most of our mushrooms in this group called the Basidiomycota. The Ascomycota has a few edibles, such as morels, mushrooms that is, as well as many molds, microfungi, as I like to say, including many yeast, and some of the most important ones, like the one that makes our beer and bread. And there's a third category called the Glomeromycota that doesn't produce mushrooms, but is very important in the soil, and we'll touch on that really briefly later. Fungi seem to be quite ancient. Some of our oldest fossils potentially suggest that they might have been around anywhere from 2 billion years ago, and some more recent findings suggest even older than that. There's even bedrock in the oceans that suggests mycelial growth from 3.5 billion years ago. So the number kind of keeps getting pushed back. There's a lot of big questions around fungal evolution and how far back they go, and when exactly they started showing up on the early Earth. Pretty interesting topic there. When plants started to first arise, to start arriving and arising, I guess, out of the terrestrial Earth, we find fungi coming in tow. We think the oldest organisms on Earth, or sort of macro-structured things, were lichens, which are 90+% fungi. But the actual true plants we first think about are these species here. And inside of them, we find these internal fungi I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. These are known as endophytic fungi, so inside of plants. And they're inside the oldest plants. So really, these helper fungi, as I like to think about them, have been there from the beginning. 80+ million years later, plants start to develop roots, and on those roots we find what are known as mycorrhizal fungi. These are another type of plant helper fungi that live on roots, and they're on the oldest plant fossils with roots. So the associations and the importance of fungi in plant health is as old as plants are, and we're only rediscovering, or sort of, I guess, just going deeper in recent years with better technology to realize how important these relationships really are. Some research says that fungi permeate the bottom of the ocean floor, the largest habitat in the world. In the driest environments, we find these crusts of living organisms, these biocrusts that are filled with fungi knitting it together, or their mycelium helping hold in the moisture and keeping dry lands more biodiverse. This is crust from Antarctica that shows this black pigmented yeast layer that helps this green algae layer survive in the coldest, driest places in the world. So here we find this theme throughout mycology: the fungi are resilient, supportive, and as humans, we might take a hint and think about how we can, as I like to say, work with them to improve our lives and those around us. One of the oldest mushrooms, I guess, ever discovered was from a sediment in the ocean floor that they dug up, got to grow actually from spore, and turned out that the mushroom was over 20 million years old. So again, fungi being very, very resilient. We now know, just to summarize a lot of this big topic on fungal ecology, that they are in the soil, important for building the structure of soils to enable water and air to flow, which is critical for life down there. They help dramatically with nutrient cycling, the moving of nutrients, which really can't be overemphasized for its importance in natural world, and just add to the diversity, the biological diversity in the soil through a million different interactions. As I mentioned, inside of plants, they produce compounds both from the interior of all the tissue of plants, by and large, and also on the roots to defend and protect the plant. They also help acquire and bring nutrients into the plant, mostly through the roots, but also in other parts as well. And they also produce compounds, both to help the plant potentially modulate its own immune functioning, as well as potentially to produce bioactive compounds that have an influence on humans. Some of the traditional medicinal plants and herbs and things that have notable bioactive compounds seem to be actually produced to some degree by the fungi that actually live inside the plant. This is one of these sort of paradigms being a little bit tossed around now. Inside of animals, we find, again, similar themes of helping with digestion, helping with the just general support of the organism, and overall providing food, both through the help with digestion, but also, of course, externally as mushrooms and even yeast that coat, say, fruits and things like that. Now, some people wonder when humans first started to work with fungi and really start to appreciate them. And I'd say one of the more common themes that's out there, ideas, is this notion that early hominids started eating psychoactive fungi and it changed the structure of their brain. This is an interesting hypothesis, but there's really no scientific evidence for it. So it's one that I really don't support personally. There's a pretty good argument against it. So something to consider if you're interested in this idea is sort of the counter argument and the more, I think, science literate argument against that idea. But certainly the notion of humans and early animals foraging for mushrooms comes in all kinds of forms. Even today, we find many different hominids and apes and monkeys and things around the world that do still eat wild mushrooms. So certainly we can wonder how far back that goes. But regardless, what does survive the historical record is just the general basics of foraging mushrooms as a wild food and to some degree as a natural medicine. Many cultures, the more we look kind of thing, the more we find that peoples around the world, traditional indigenous cultures, have worked with mushrooms in a variety of ways. But unfortunately, that's been those pathways and those methods have been either poorly transmitted through the generations and or poorly recorded by documentarians and settlers and things like this from the past. So we have bits and pieces from around the world, and a lot of it is quite interesting, but certainly there's much more to be uncovered. And again, I think revisiting some of the things we assume about the past and going back over them with a more mycologically tuned comb to think about what we might have missed the first time around. There's many good examples. One that I always like to point to is the mushroom amadou. This is a tinder conch, as we call it. It smolders and burns quite slowly and was thought to have carried the ember for different cultures and peoples as they traveled. It's also produces a nice pungent smoke. It smells quite nice, and people in Siberia would burn it with the bark of the silver pine tree to cleanse the house of a deceased person. So really interesting customs and practices alongside just straight eating mushrooms. This mushroom is perhaps most famous for being found on the belt of OMSI the Iceman. He was found in 1994, died in the Alps between Austria and Switzerland, roughly 5,400 years ago, I believe, somewhere around there. And he was like a living time capsule, many tools all around him, lots of things to study. And among those possessions on his tool belt, right near his hands, were two different types of mushrooms. This one that he likely used for a heat source or for a smoldering type of source, and another that he likely consumed to help treat his internal parasites, that mushroom having really strong anti-parasitic oils. In North America, many Native American cultures, as far as have again sort of scattered documentation, have used different mushrooms for different reasons around the country, around the continent. One of the more common themes we find in many different cultures, including these, is the use of puffball spores and mixing those with spider webs to rub on either the cut umbilical cord or just generally wounds to help slow bleeding. In Southwest Canada, sort of a similar region to where I'm currently located in Oregon, OMSI is located, the Haida people would carve this mushroom, the agarikon mushroom, one of our really special rare mushrooms that only grows on old growth trees in our temperate rainforest. And they would carve it into little figurines, usually with some sort of opening that was meant to capture the spirit of their deceased medicine people. And when the sort of archaeologists started digging up the graves and found these things, they actually thought they were made out of wood until they tested it and figured out it was made of mushroom. Around the world, in Asia, we have great and rich traditions in China, Japan, and other countries. And thankfully, is much better documented than we find in other parts of the world, especially in China, where the records go back several thousand years. One of the better examples of sort of this merging of culture and custom and mushroom is with the Kuan Yin, the goddess of healing and mercy. And here she's holding the reishi mushroom, one of the most artistically depicted mushrooms of all time, alongside our very famous red and white Amanita fly agaric mushroom. In Japan, we have statues, or rather monuments and temples dedicated to the supposed inventor and discoverer of shiitake log cultivation. Growing shiitake mushrooms on hardwood, typically oak logs outdoors, is roughly 1,000-year-old practice and deeply seated in Japanese and Chinese custom and cuisine. And it's so important that the discoverer of the practice, Mr. Wu Sanggu, has several temples dedicated to him around the country, and even smaller ones in cultivation-focused villages. He's holding in this, it's hard to see in the photo, but he's actually holding a mushroom in one hand and a stick in the other hand that he would use to hit the logs and to trigger them to fruit mushrooms, trying to simulate the notion of the log falling out of the tree, which is thought to be part of the triggering of the fruiting of the mushroom. We also find in that part of the world a whole museum dedicated to the mushroom, as well as artwork and statues like this that sort of popularize mushrooms or normalize them in ways that we don't really find in the West. It's this big question we might have of why do we not carry on these types of traditions in the West with mushrooms? How did the sort of fear of fungi, what we call mycophobia, develop? And why has it stuck around for so long when, as we'll see, fungi are pretty cool and certainly worthwhile spending the time to learn and teach to children. Perhaps one of the better things we've gotten over the years is that movie Super Mario Brothers. It definitely features fungi as one of the superheroes of the movie. So I certainly recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it since the 90s. Pretty good movie. But unfortunately, most people don't see that movie. They might see or hear on the news or in other films or what have you, something that is along the notion of this other movie called Shrooms. And the idea that, you know, the only way you can work with fungi or engage with them is to either get sick or to have an altered state of reality or to die. And that's such a tiny percentage of the possibilities of working with mushrooms and other fungi. For me, mushrooms and all fungi, really the mycelium, all these layers is really quite beautiful. There's much to appreciate just from an aesthetic perspective, let alone from the practical and functional value that they have in the environment and for human cultures. Many people come from maybe a mycophobic, fungi-fearing background, whether from their schooling, from their family, come to discover mushrooms, and this has certainly been the trend in recent years, and discover a whole new world. And much of it is pretty exciting, pretty inspiring. Again, really amazing with how special and unique fungi are, and really mind-opening and just really exploratory. And you don't have to do anything other than just appreciate the fungi around you. Even if you can't identify them, a lot of people that start to open their eyes for it and just start to appreciate the fungi, small and large, I think it kind of turns on a little question or a light bulb of seeing the world in a slightly different way. How far back, though, this relationship does go, that is best documented as far as the consumption is going to that red lady found in the cave in Cantabria, Spain, roughly. Well, she was found in, I believe, 2012, but she dates back almost 19,000 years ago. And on the plaque of her teeth, she did have the spores of 2 mushrooms, which we've yet to identify. She was covered in this red ochre paint, hence her name, and really ceremonially buried. So it's actually wondered if she was maybe had held a high position in the culture, which then makes you wonder, did the higher up people eat mushrooms, and did everybody eat mushrooms, and what was the relationship? Considering the red paint, people have postulated or questioned whether maybe she ate a very, very famous red and white mushroom. Amanita muscaria. It is edible. Actually, if you prepare it, you can wash out the toxins that will make you nauseous, and that can also alter your consciousness to some degree. And some of these compounds look like this. What's notable is that they are dramatically different categorically from the more popular compounds that are being researched by Johns Hopkins University. And currently in Oregon, there's a bill to seek legalization for treatment using psilocybin and psilocin and some related compounds. But they're in a totally different category. So this very famous mushroom that we see all the time, red and white mushroom, actually has different compounds, different active, psychoactive compounds. So we find mushroom consumption with the red lady, but then we find other things that we can't really correlate and leads to some speculation. We find mushroom-esque shaped dolmens, large megalithic structures all around the world. This one from the UK called Chungquilt. I hope that's how you say it. But also this is one from India, and there's many all around, kind of scattered a good bit around the old world. Largely with no known origin. You can't really date stone accurately, and no bodies buried underneath it or anything like that. So what their purpose was, what their function was, is speculative at best, but certainly we might wonder if they weren't some sort of shrine or something like that to mushrooms. Interesting question for me. In a similar way, but perhaps even more focused, people have revisited some of archaeology, as I've hinted at, and said maybe there was a mycological footprint left that people have overlooked. One of the more intriguing ones comes from ancient Egypt, where most notably the goddess Heket, who's associated with decay and decomposition and many of the things that fungi actually do, is often found feeding the Ankh, this symbol to other gods and goddesses, which some people have argued is actually a representation of the mushroom. There's good paper. There's actually several, well, at least one peer-reviewed paper and a good bit of other speculative writings saying that this was actually one of the more secretive aspects of ancient Egypt, sort of a food for the gods, as the mushrooms were known to be called by the ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks, was perhaps actually a very central part of some of the more higher up classes of people's secret practices. Some of the temples, some of the structures seem to have mushroom-shaped columns and pillars. But again, there's just very few people speculating on this because it is so sort of counterintuitive to what we commonly think of as ancient Egyptian practices. Some of the more recent, better documentation, I guess you'd say, around traditional use of some, not just psychoactive fungi, but other fungi, come from Siberia. Here's an example of one of their shaman or medicine people working with the famous Amanita. And they work with reindeer. They live in the far north. They are supposedly sometimes travel through the rooftop of their huts to deliver these mushrooms to their group members, who will then dry the mushroom by the fire. And for this and many other reasons, this practice has been suggested be correlated with the Santa Claus story. So if this is new to you, there's much to learn about on the internet about this, but I always like to throw it out there, especially around this time of year, something to think about. We also do find in many cultures similarities between the connection between mushrooms and toads. The notion of the toadstool, just the name toadstool, actually occurs in many parts around the world, many disparate cultures that did not communicate as far as we know, called many mushrooms, toad mushroom, frog mushroom, etc., which is coincidental perhaps, but also curiously similar to the degree that that reverence was given to toads and frogs in many of these cultures. While we don't have that type of reverence for amphibians in the West today, many traditional cultures saw frogs and toads as sort of a symbolic representation of metamorphosis, and sometimes related to women and the feminine principle and things, due to the connection between water and land. And so this notion that the mushroom was connected to that, to me, makes me wonder if perhaps some traditional cultures sort of had a reverence for mushrooms, sort of a respect for their unusualness, the fact they come out of the ground with no clear seed, and some of them taste a certain way, some of them will kill you, some of them make you feel certain ways. You know, you might imagine that traditional peoples who didn't quite understand what these things were exactly held a pretty good degree of respect for them. Similarly, we find many cultures stating that mushrooms were created by lightning, not so much the rain that comes with lightning, but the actual lightning strikes itself. Not only does lightning look like mycelium, which is perhaps coincidental, but also it's a very powerful, mysterious force from the sky. It comes down along with rain, but then a few days later, these mysterious mushrooms pop up So we find many mushrooms traditionally called lightning mushroom, red lightning mushroom, one-legged lightning mushroom, things like this, again, in many parts around the world in separated cultures. One of the better examples of maybe this sort of fear and respect of fungi comes from the fear of fairy rings, and many cultures around the world that had different myths around how you should treat a fairy ring, a ring of mushrooms growing in a field, which is really just started from mycelium in the center, and it grows radially, equidistantly, and every season the mushrooms pop up on the edge of that ring of mycelium, right at the tips. And every year that ring should get bigger, and you can actually sort of roughly gauge the age of a ring based on how large it is. But again, people not necessarily understanding that this thing looks pretty weird. And so you have myths and rhymes and stories about how you must dance around it a certain way and sing certain songs, or just outright avoid it lest you be stolen to the land of the fairies. This is a traditional rhyme. I believe I pulled it off Wikipedia, so I'll just switch slides, but you can find it there. We might also wonder about the blight fungi that, of course, have troubled different cultures, especially more recently. Here's a photo of a Dutch elm. So Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight. These are some of our more famous agricultural blights and tree blights of the last century. And in the really wonderful book, The Triumph of the Fungi by the mycologist Nicholas Money, he points out that while these fungi did cause major problems, if we actually look to the roots, and now we've figured out that they were by and large caused by human mismanagement, whether humans brought a tree species to a whole new location and it brought a disease with it, or say a monocultural type system was developed and the plant didn't have the type of fungal defenses that it needed on its roots or elsewhere, and thus became susceptible to disease. In a similar but different way, we have the Irish potato famine, which was actually caused by a slime mold, and which is not a true fungus. It's actually something more closely related to an amoeba. And yet this maybe lingers in our history and thinking about how fungi can wipe out whole cultures and civilizations and things. But by and large, we find that fungi, the bad fungi, show up usually when an agricultural or plant-based system is really unnatural, a bit out of balance. The plants are starved and weakened. And then so fungi come in and kind of clear the slate is how I think about it. In the world of eco-psychology, it's a sort of sub-branch of psychology. There's this notion that in modern life, we are not as connected to the natural world, and that has a detriment to us, and we should spend more time out in nature. A pretty easy argument. And I would just add on to that this notion of mycopsychology, that by having cut out and sort of run away or being afraid of this huge part of the natural world that's super important, maybe we're doing ourselves a disservice, if nothing else, by not being able to appreciate these really incredible and special organisms. And especially for the kids who, anytime you show them fungi or mushrooms, they usually freak out because of how weird they are. Other practices we can take back into ancient past is with the fermenting fungi. So we talked a bit about the mushrooms, but there's also all the microfungi, and the yeast are some of the most important. It's thought that human civilization actually settled and became what we think of as modern-ish settled civilizations due to the fact that they wanted to grow more crops so that they can make more beer and bread, and primarily the beer. And both those things are made fundamentally with yeast, or supported and fermented by yeast, and yeast are fungi. So here we have this really subtle but important way that a major shift in human history was caused by and large by the effects, the chemistry, the magic and mystery of these microfungi. This is an example from a Sumerian tablet showing several people sharing an ale through a vat with large reed straws. And what you find in some of these ancient cultures, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Sumeria, is that they not only appreciated fungal ferments and alcoholic drinks, but actually celebrated as this magical gift from the gods that alleviated stress and things. And so the beer and the act of fermentation, because it wasn't understood, would be treated as a sort of custom in this ritual, and there'd be dance and song, and even a magic wooden wand would be sort of put in the vat between each batch, carrying the yeast microscopically to inoculate the next one after. Several other very important fungal ferments include the moldy grapes that create botrytized wine. It doesn't look so great, but actually makes your grapes more condensed, more sweet. And so this special dessert wine is actually fairly expensive, or the wine that comes from these grapes. We also have moldy rice, here a red mold that actually produces a compound historically used in ancient China as a royal red dye source, but we now find is actually helpful for reducing cholesterol. In Central America, this very strange looking corn cob is actually infected with a mold fungus that transforms, if you will, the kernels into these masses that, though not so pretty, taste amazing. And sadly, you can by and large only get them canned in the US, although there are methods for cultivating them intentionally on your corn. But the people that do find them, especially in Central America, where the food is highly celebrated, this is, again, a kind of a common ingredient in the cuisine. And similarly, but sort of different, is the miso. Now, miso is made in a multi-step and long-term process, but fundamentally what's happening, especially with the corn before, what's known as wheat lakoche, and here with miso, is that the fungi involved, through their unique chemical transformations, their mastery of chemistry, as I like to say, create flavors and effects in our mouth that stimulate the umami sensor, the fifth flavor beyond sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. It's the flavor of filling and richness and savoriness. And fungi are really good at that. Animal products have it. Some plant foods have it, like seaweed, but a lot of fungal products have it, especially some of these fermenting microfungi create these really complex, super dynamic, incredibly delicious flavors that you ultimately cannot reproduce. And hence they're at the center of some of these cultures. We also have other fermented drinks, kombucha, kefir in various forms, and these are made of communities, of microbes and fungi that transform one liquid into something that is arguably good for your health in various ways. Even inside of our animal products, or rather some of our staple animals, especially our ruminants, we find microfungi helping with the digestion. Here with the largest cow in the world, inside of its first stomach, it's a rumen. There's actually a group of microfungi that do the pre-digestion. They ferment the grass and things and create and release the proteins that the cow then spits up as cud to then swallow to its true stomach. So that initial digestion is all primarily formed by fungi, and thus we benefit, those who eat animal products, from all that hidden fungal work. Another big flip side to this, as far as the nutrient moving and food for life, is the movement of minerals. We've only studied so little how fungi actually help dissolve rock and use acids, organic acids they release to dissolve rock. Big study, big question marks. One thing that we've speculated is that, as you see on the right side, this is a strand of fungal mycelium covered in this type of crystal. And this is one of the most common calcium deposited crystals in the soil. And so this is quite important because calcium is a fundamental component of plant cells. So fungi create these crystals, help store the calcium in the soil long-term or longer term, so it doesn't just wash away or go somewhere else, so that plants can later come along and use it. Pretty important, pretty fundamental approach here, or aspect of what we call geomycology. But again, probably just scratching the iceberg about how they influence soil and plants and animals and insects, etc. These fungi and many others in the soil act like what people have termed the wood wide web, sort of a neurological metaphor or nervous system rather, for soil, moving nutrients where they need to go between plants. And in as much as that sounded pretty fringe 10 plus years ago, the science has pretty much proven this to be the case, where the fungi, and studies have been done in various formats, but they will move, say, from a healthy parent tree that has lots of sun, nutrients through the connection that the mycelium shares from the parent tree to an offspring, to a sapling. It'll move carbon, move nutrients from the parent to the offspring, so that shaded out offspring in the depths of the forest can survive. And that's just one example. That's from, say, parent to offspring, but they've done it between plant species and from one direction and also the other direction and many other ways. And so really fungi move nutrients through the forest in a way that, say, bacteria can't. And really the way that animals move nutrients through their droppings, they move it, but then it has to be, utilized by other organisms. But what fungi are doing below the surface, and to some degree quite rapidly and quite efficiently, is not performed by any other organisms. So fundamental to plant health. And really, because of this, they've been termed the nervous type system, but I also think of them similar to the circulatory system, where they're moving nutrients, and even like the lymphatic system, and also purging toxins in various ways. We have this type of fungi that, excuse me, are on the oldest plant roots. These are ones we can cultivate. They're called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and they form structures inside of plant root cells. Very important, some of the most common ecologically significant fungi, but they form no mushrooms. What we're more familiar with these root connecting fungi are the ectomycorrhizae. They form a very thick skin or sheath of mycelium around the roots. And that's what that blue layer is in the upper right. And this is what enables the development of some of the most popular wild harvested mushrooms. And that's why these mushrooms are wild harvested, because they can only be foraged near a tree or near a shrub that they are associating with. We can't cultivate them indoors. So for folks in Oregon or many parts of the country, these are some of the more popular ectomycorrhizal wild mushrooms that, if you're not so certain about identifying yourself, you certainly might look to joining your local mycological society to learn all about and to safely harvest. There's also some of these fungi that can be cultivated and are used here in Oregon to inoculate our Douglas fir and western hemlock to enable the tree plantations to keep going. The trees fundamentally need these fungi, these root associating fungi, to live. You can see that in this last little clip. The plants just will not grow. They've evolved essentially over time since the first plant with roots to need fungi to bring them the right nutrients in the right ways at the right time. What's going on the left is little balls of mycelium in the lower left can be cultivated on a petri dish, and then a little sapling can be put right next to that, and the roots will grow into the mycelium. And you can see this right on the petri dish. Around the world, desert truffles are a traditional source of food in North Africa and the Mediterranean region. Trifesia is a popular genus there. They're kind of like protein-rich potatoes grown in the desert. And in recent years, these have been figured to be cultivated on the rock rose family of plants and shrubs, rather. So certainly we might hope that in the future, in dry parts of the world, say California, Arizona, other parts like this might become a new crop. Certainly it's sort of cutting edge perspective or possibility. When we remove these mycorrhizal fungi and we sort of till and damage the soil in various ways through compaction, chemicals, leaching the soil, losing the soil, monsoons, all kinds of stuff, and tillage, we lose these beneficial fungi. And so plant roots have no defenses, no natural defenses. And so they're, again, as I said earlier, more prone to attack. And then we come in with more chemicals, and it's sort of this downward spiral. So a big argument that I would put out there is, big ag could consider using fungi more efficiently, and not just in the root level, but actually in many other systems. On the flip side of fungi, we have the root associating mushrooms I just mentioned, and then also the decomposer mushrooms. And these are the ones that we cultivate, and these are the ones that are perhaps most familiar to you if you're not a wild forager, and if you've been paying attention to news headlines and things, because these are the ones that are rapidly gaining more accessibility due to increasingly easy means of cultivating them. And this comes from a roughly 100-year history of what once was very technical laboratory-based skills developed in Pennsylvania about 100 years ago, over time being translated into very simple kitchen scale techniques that you can truly do while you're making dinner. Really, mushroom cultivation is, depending on your approach, just like any other fermentation hobby, kind of as simple or as complex as you want to make it. You can make your first batch of simple beer or mead or sauerkraut, and it might come out okay, maybe not the best in the world, but you did it and it worked. And if you stick with it, excuse me, if you stick with it, it'll get better and better and easier. Same with mushroom cultivation. There's very simple techniques nowadays that weren't even available 7 years ago to make it so simple and so accessible. But this does come from a long lineage where throughout most of the last century, we would take mushroom tissue, that is mycelium from the inside of a mushroom, or the spores, get it to grow and isolate it, get it nice and clean in a laboratory. And this was the really tricky part. So then separately, we would take some grains like rye or millet or wheat berries. We sterilize them in a pressure canner, usually in a jar. And then we introduce some of that mycelium that we cleaned up. And then a few weeks later, the mycelium would grow over the grains. So there's no symbiotic relationship, no roots needed, nothing really complex. Just give it food and water and some air and nice warm temperature, and it just eats and grows. And then from there, depending on the species, we either put that mycelium covered grain what we call grain spawn onto either sawdust. Many of our mushrooms like shiitake here, variety of other gourmet mushrooms prefer to grow on wood, or straw. In some cases, oyster mushrooms you might get at the grocery store, they grow on wood in nature, but actually they can eat lots of stuff. They eat coffee grounds, and straw is very commonly used as a growing medium. Or, of course, compost or manure, which maybe is one of the more familiar notions. Mushrooms have to grow on manure, but it's actually a very small percentage. Most notably are very well-known butt mushrooms and portobellos, which in my opinion are some of the least tasty mushrooms actually you can have. There's also a means of cultivating mycelium in a liquid machines, essentially, that keep the nutrients and pH and air just right. And this is done both for cultivation purposes, mushroom cultivation, but also to capture the compounds the fungi release. Fungi as great chemists. This is this big topic I've just sort of brushed over, but they release all kinds of compounds depending on the fungus. And as mentioned during the trivia, some of the most important ones that they release are ethanol by some of the yeast and citric acid by one of our penicillium species. And chemists over the last century have figured out how to grow these fungi in huge vats, and fungi just naturally release the compounds, and then the chemists can filter out the mycelium and then collect the chemicals. This method has been scaled down to another home-scale mushroom cultivation method. And just to summarize, it's made it a lot simpler. Basically, it's cut out a lot of the complexity of the 20th century of growing mushrooms to making it that kitchen scalable, making it during dinner time hobby. This has now opened up the pathway that we're rapidly going towards of the future of really anybody that wants to give it a shot can grow mushrooms and mycelium in ways that have, never been possible in all of human history. We live in a really unique era of not only understanding the ecological importance of fungi and many things there, but also be able to cultivate them easily. And now we can bring those two together, and sort of the applications or applied mycology is this new frontier that is essentially, again, unprecedented, untapped potential, and full of untapped potential. So what I'm showing here are just a few of the more commonly discussed options or possibilities that we could think about going forward. We have a couple invasive plants. So kudzu on the left, or on my left, and water hyacinth on the right, incredibly fast growing plants that can be used as food for mushrooms. We can also take a lot of agricultural waste, hundreds of agricultural waste, that many of which can't be used for anything maybe apart from composting. Many of them can't even be fed to animals. We can take them, grow mushrooms on them, get another crop, and now the fungus has fermented and broken it down, and we can feed the byproduct, the mycelium covered, say, coffee husks, feed that to animals now because it's become available to the animal to eat. And again, there's lots of examples like that, a lot of possibilities, a lot of studies, just very little application due to limited access. Here are just some more home scale type approaches. So growing oysters on coffee grounds and cardboard in a bucket, growing king oysters out of a mason jar. So stuff you maybe could imagine doing. This is one of my former students growing oysters in her corn patch in high elevation Arizona. So again, in kind of a more unusual climate, she's growing mushrooms outdoors. This is a 4-species mushroom spiral labyrinth garden that I designed and installed in Southwest Portland several years ago at a community farm. So this approach, just a different way of thinking about growing mushrooms. Yes, it's for food, but also, there's some aesthetics we can mix into it all as well. This is another mushroom installation I did with an organization called City Repair here in Portland, where it was a all native fruit, nut, and mushroom food forest garden in a park in Southwest Portland. And those are just some of the examples of the ways that we can incorporate fungi into our landscape. It's one of these things I try to promote to cultivators, because so much of what we do farming is actually indoors. It's quite different than plants, but why should we stop there? Because we can actually take these skills outdoors. And finally, one of the last skills I'll close with, one of the last big concepts and one of the big frontiers, is this notion of mycoremediation. And this is one of the very hot topics, I'd say, in mycology, because we have found, after several decades of research and clear evidence, that the same species that can break down wood in nature, which is essentially the most complex substance nature produces, is the hard molecule in wood called lignin. Those species mushrooms and other fungi that can break that down can also break down some of the most complex chemicals we've engineered as humans. And these are just some of the example categories of compounds, many of which have these types of ringed chemical structures you can see, which, to summarize, makes them more stable. They just persist in the environment, especially when you get a lot of these rings all together. It's really complex, hard to break apart. Bacteria don't do so well at it, and yet fungi can. And so we've seen it in the lab over the years that many fungi can break this stuff down. So now moving forward, there's quite a number of people looking at how we can take that idea and apply it to old gas stations or other places where concentrated chemical has been spilled, collect the soil, grow fungi through it, have them eat the stuff, and then hopefully clean it to, safe levels. This is a video I'll leave to you to check out more online, but I made a bunch of years ago showing growing oyster mushrooms on used cigarette filters. Cigarette filters, before you smoke them, are just mostly paper and usually sometimes just cotton. The problem is after they get smoked, they get filled with potentially 2,000 of these types of toxic compounds. And when they go into the environment, those toxins leak into the ocean eventually. Mushrooms, as I show here, and many of my students and other people have repeated this process and this technique, can eat those compounds ostensibly and more or less thrive on them. It's a pretty easy project to recreate if you are at all inclined in this kind of stuff, so encourage checking that out. Nowadays, I'm involved in an organization or company, rather, Mycocycle, where we're looking at other major waste streams, cigarettes being one of the biggest waste streams individuals produce, but there's also major waste streams that major industries produce that could be caught before they just go to the landfill. And in as much as we will hope that those industries change their ways, in the meantime, and during this transition period, there's still a lot of waste being produced. And there's, here in this example, we're growing off of roofing materials, asphalt impregnated roofing materials, which is one of the biggest landfillers in the world is roofing materials. And we're growing mushrooms successfully off of that. So keep an eye out for Mycocycle going forward. Another possibility for working with fungi is removing heavy metals from water. Essentially, mycelium can be placed into contaminated water, and the metals will stick to the mycelium, something like a magnet, similar but different, and the mycelium can be removed and the metals recovered and recycled, and the same mycelium put back to remove that heavy metal, those heavy metals from the water even more. Doesn't work so well in a rushing river per se, but in a stagnant body of water where there's known heavy metals, this is certainly an option, and actually one of the, again, easier processes that, with a little bit of a learning curve, but really not that big of one, could actually be applied quite readily. And lastly, just something to think about as we switch over to Q&A is just how fungi might surround you in your life and how they influence your thinking about the world. We typically only see them, if anything, in usually the red and white amanita mushroom in various forms of art. Maybe we get lucky and we hear the album produced by this person on archive.org, which is a free recording of him holding the mushroom to his ear and playing diddlies on the piano of what the mushrooms, I guess, sing to him. Several years ago, I helped collaborate and put together a Radical Mycology mixtape with artists and audio musicians around the world. It's free on the Radical Mycology Bandcamp, so you can check that out. And this year, and actually this month, running alongside a couple other great organizers, the world's first short film festival dedicated to fungi. And these are just two screenshots of over 30 different films from around the world, 14 countries. But they're funny because it's two of them with Amanita muscaria, the red and white mushroom, on people's heads, but not all of them are like that. Another event is Radical Mycology Convergence. You can check that out. We will have it in Oregon, again, outside Portland next year. It was postponed for this year, where we do all kinds of workshops, hands-on skills, forays. This is a nonprofit organization doing a survey of all the wild fungi found on site and documenting it sort of for posterity and better understanding of fungal diversity. We have an international art show, as well as the Mycolympics. Here's the donut eating contest from that, one of my favorite parts of the weekend. And then if you want to learn more, I offer a variety of online courses through Microscopic, with many more to come this year and definitely into next year, and definitely a lot of in-person stuff going on in Portland when the time comes. So check that out. And thanks so much again, OMSI. I'm happy to dive into all the questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. What a great talk on mycology. Really, really engaging. Thank you. And we've got all kinds of questions from the folks listening and watching in at home. So I'd like to toss you a couple questions here. Right there at the end, you kind of mentioned a community farm. This is a quick one. Where is that community farm that you mentioned?
Well, so that installation was at Tryon Life Community Farm in Southwest Portland. They butt right up against Tryon State Park, and actually that part of their farm is publicly accessible. But I think the actual installation hasn't been as kept up, so it's not really active right now. But every couple of years, the people I work with there are really happy to keep it going. It's just sort of a, usually by my instigating, and when there's folks that want to make it happen again, we clean it all up and dig a new spiral. But Tryon, it's a great farm. They do all kinds of workshops in their own right, all kinds of stuff.
Great, thank you. So there's a set of questions here sort of to get into. How would you recommend somebody just getting started with cultivating mushrooms at home? Where would be a good place to start?
Well, I mean, as with anything these days, you can learn ton on YouTube. So, I mean, I've learned a good bit there. I learned a lot more historically through books, and actually there's a good number of forums, and arguably the forums are the best. There's some good Facebook groups, but as with all the Facebook, it's hard to scroll and find stuff and bookmark and things. So some of those popular forums are shroomery.org and mycotopia.net. Shroomery is the biggest. They cater heavily to psychoactive fungi, but there is definitely a culinary section, and it's the same techniques apply. Growing one plant. If you can grow one plant, you can kind of grow most of the other ones. We have a basic idea. Same thing with mushrooms. You just got to be aware, ready that there's going to be there's a big section dedicated to those fungi, those mushrooms, but you can find a big discussion on the culinaries. It's a great resource. I mean, there's a number of books, but that might not be the best for everybody. I mean, I certainly like to do workshops of all kinds. Historically, I would teach mushroom cultivation all the time, all around the continent. Not so much this year, but certainly next year, folks are in the area. And you might have, as mycology's grown and gotten more and more popular, people are popping up all over North America teaching in various forms, especially in intro to cultivation, some of the basics. I would say, last thing though, is just if you want to look at one technique, oyster mushrooms on wheat straw. That's probably your most fundamental. It's tried and true, lots of info on that one. And you can do it in a plastic bag or a little 3-gallon or 5-gallon bucket, and definitely very doable. A lot of support out there for that.
Awesome, thanks. Sticking with that culinary side of things, here's a question. What are the effects on the environment of harvesting the same area or patch every season? What are the effects over a long period of time, if any?
Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good long-term studies on the effects of wild mushroom foraging and harvesting. Some of the better research comes out of Europe, where they've more or less found that it's not so much the harvesting. One of the arguments historically was that if we harvested the mushroom when it was young, it wouldn't have a chance to spread its spores, and so it couldn't reproduce. We find that that's not as much of a problem as trampling and compacting the soil and really harming the mycelial network and the surrounding vegetation that those wild mushrooms might be associating with. And so, as with any good leave no trace practice, if you're in a large group, spread out. If you're in a small group, single file line. Just being really cognizant, really respectful of the environment, and hopefully it'll treat you well in return.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and sticking with that question, here's that theme. Here's another question. Could you speak to the phenomenon of truffle hunting pigs and dogs? Why are some fungi more findable?
Well, truffles, gourmet truffles, emit a certain compound. It's a very long name I won't try to say here, but it's a very specific compound that is actually similar in scent to a female pig in heat. And so that was why the pigs were used historically to find them, because it would smell like a partner for the animal was coming out of the ground, and so they'd seek it out. Nowadays, dogs, especially Labrador poodles, are one of the more popular breeds. can be trained quite easily. There's fairly straightforward practices where you can either get a synthetic form of the scent, or actually get, better yet, the actual fresh truffle, and you rub the scent, or you bury it in your house, or you train the dog just like you might train it to do anything else. And so when you get out to the field, those breeds and that breed and others have a really good nose for it. And so they'll find it, start to dig, and you just pull them aside. And sometimes a mushroom, you know, several inches down below the ground, and yet they can smell it. So pretty difficult. The other, if you don't have the animal, people are looking for squirrels, rodent marks, because sometimes the rodents will dig it up and take a little nibble, and then they'll leave, you know, evidence. But you got to have a keen eye, and definitely take some training and things.
Here, so now in this kind of category of cultivating and growing mushrooms at home, here's a question about that you left us with, and cultivating mushrooms on the cigarette filters. When you grow mushrooms on cigarette filters, etc., can you still eat those mushrooms? And do the toxins from the cigarettes go into the mushrooms at all?
So good rule of thumb is you never want to eat a mushroom growing off of anything questionable. So mushrooms growing on the side of the road, they could be pulling up, just like plants can, the mushrooms can pull up heavy metals out of the soil into the mushroom. We call it the fruit body, but they can pull it up and hyperaccumulate it and concentrate it. And so you definitely don't want to eat mushrooms in a parking lot or anything like that, or in an old abandoned industrial site where maybe the soil is really polluted. Similarly, if we're growing mushrooms, or you're buying mushrooms from a place and you're not quite sure what they were growing on, if they were, that could be from anywhere in the world, you might wonder about their quality. There's rumors. I haven't done the testing myself. I would actually like to, of, you know, imported mushrooms testing high in heavy metals, implying that they were grown on something that had heavy metals. Who knows? But still, you know, that's why you might want to lean towards organics, or know your farmer at the very least, to know what they're growing and things like that. As far as growing on these cigarettes, though, so you would never eat those mushrooms. Cigarettes can and often do have heavy metals, so they could be concentrating that. But even the chemicals that are in there, I would never say without, you know, extensive testing that all the chemicals are going to be gone. People have repeated that study, and actually I know some people have basically did their final project in college just on growing oysters on cigarette butts after watching my video, and actually had access to a lab and did a bunch of tests, and dramatic declines in some of them are more sort of target compounds. But, you know, there could be 2,000, and it's actually quite difficult to test for every single one individually. So maybe one of them got missed. So you can't easily make those kind of claims. And you find that in other parts of remediation, where sometimes, you know, people exaggerate or stretch the imagination. But the mushroom could take up the chemical, I guess is the answer, alongside the heavy metals. That has been shown. It's not as common, but yeah, it is a possibility.
So there's a group of questions about if people wanted to start growing edible mushrooms at home and in their garden, what do you recommend, and how would they go about doing that?
Well, I mean, it's if you're totally new to it, it's, you know, a good bit of a skill. I would defer back to my earlier answer, which is if you're trying to grow them in your house and you're starting basically from zero. Well, one, you can just buy kits that are ready to fruit. So other growers do all the work, and all you do is you just buy it, cut a hole in it, cut a slit, follow the instructions, and then mist it with water to keep it moist. The mushrooms need a good bit of humidity to mature, and that's the easiest way. If you really want to do a little bit more than that, then learning how to grow oysters on straw. That looks like buying grain spawn. So if you remember, grains covered in mycelium. It's kind of like a seed, but it's not a seed. It's a carrier of mycelium. And you would sprinkle that onto wheat straw that you've shred in your driveway with a lawnmower or with a weed whacker or something like this. And then you actually have to heat treat it. So you'd soak it in 150-degree Fahrenheit water for an hour in a pillowcase, in a burlap sack. Get creative. There's lots of ways that people do that bit of treating the straw. Drain it, cool it, and then mix the mycelium, the grain spawn, as we say, into it, and then pack it into a bag or a bucket and let it sit. And so that's really, you know, again, a 50,000 foot view of the process. Lots of good videos out there and things to learn how to do that in more detail, but it's pretty straightforward. You're going to mess it up once or twice or 5 times, but don't hold back. Don't be afraid. Just kind of embrace that. That's part of the learning process. You might get also really super lucky the first time and have huge success. A lot of people do, but I always just encourage embracing the potential for making a mistake, as we all do. But then it gets really easy and really fun. You could be doing it, every other week with your friends kind of thing, and make it a routine. Outdoors in the garden, hands down, the most popular outdoor mushroom is called the garden giant, or king stropharia, or queen stropharia, or burgundy cap. It has many names because of how popular it is. And it basically grows like gangbusters in almost anything you throw at it. It loves fresh hardwood chips. That's a good go-to, but it'll eat maybe slightly more composty type stuff, not exactly fresh vegetables, but kinds of just random scraps from the garden, leaves and bamboo stalks and paper plates, Douglas fir wood chips to some degree here in the Northwest. But it's really voracious, and once it establishes, it can actually travel around your garden. Once you get a little patch you'll see the mycelium is very, very clear, very white. You can pick a bit up, move it over here, start another little patch. So it's pretty amazing. Share it with your friends. Pretty fun mushroom, and one of the easiest outdoors, one of the most guaranteed. Right after that, but in requiring a good bit more work, just as far as learning and getting some tools and things, and you're kind of getting everything arranged, is growing shiitake on logs. And again, that's about 1,000-year-old practice. We have the technique down pretty good at this point, but just sort of the steps involved, there's multiple, and becomes basically a half-a-day process if it's your first time doing it.
Great. Here's a question from Rylan, age 6. Thanks for your question, Rylan. What is your favorite mushroom to learn about?
Easy. Well, they got two of them. They're toe to toe. So probably one of my favorite to learn about while I was researching my book was the amadou mushroom. Really common in birch forests and things, but really interesting historically. A lot of cultures around the world, and in Eurasia, the old world, burning it for smokes and smudges, and just a cool mushroom kind of culturally. And then on the flip side, for a long time, and still one of my favorite, is the turkey tail mushroom. It's one of the easier ones to identify. There are lookalikes, but none that are incredibly poisonous or anything. None of them are deadly poisonous, but you always want to make sure you're 100% sure on your IDs. But turkey tail, it's fairly easy to identify. Quite beautiful, easy to cultivate, good for your health. Lots of research. One of the most important medicinal mushrooms, tons and tons of decades of research on it, and a great remediator. So it's been shown to break down all kinds of chemicals, and it's a real powerhouse and super strong decomposer in that way.
Awesome. Thanks again for that question, Rylan. Here's a question about the heavy metals that have come up a few times and how mushrooms can absorb heavy metals in the ground. So can mushrooms you eat absorb metals and heavy metals from your body like they do from the land?
I mean, not so much. I mean, fungi produce antioxidants and things that can help with some radicals, but I've never seen, I've heard things like this, and you'll read things like this, that fungi are good. The term is chelators, and they'll help pull metals out of your body. I might have just missed the studies, but I haven't actually seen the studies really proving that. So I can't really say one way or the other, I guess. I would lean towards they can't, but I would love to be proven wrong. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So going back to the culinary side of things, for someone who's only bought mushrooms from the supermarket, what would be 2 or 3 types for a good novice taste entry level kind of that's easily found also in the market and stores?
In the grocery store. Well, so not part of it is not just the species, but also how it's prepared. And this is, maybe a bit of a debate depending on how chef skilled you are or what your palate is. For me, whenever I've gotten mushrooms at a restaurant, as a good example, usually it's either, portobellos, buttons, and cremini. Those are actually all the same species. They're just at different stages of growth. And usually to my palate, they're undercooked. So they're kind of just minimally warmed, still quite rubbery, kind of chewy, kind of really wet and slimy. Not my preferred texture for really any mushroom. How I like to prepare most any mushroom is slice it, dry saute it, low, medium heat in a pan, dry pan. and then just stir it. And after a while, the cells start to break down, and the water, there's lots of water. 90% of the fruit body, the mushroom, is water. And all that water starts to steam out. And you start to concentrate the flavor, lose some of that slippery texture you might not like, and it sort of firms up the tissue, makes it a little more chewy, maybe even crunchy if you let it go long enough. But I just stir till it stops steaming, and then I throw in my oil source, whatever that is, and then fry it, get it nice and almost crunchy, not quite, crisp and brittle, but a good bit more bite to it. And then a little bit of, definitely some salt, maybe a little bit of pepper. And that is it. That's how I like to do most any mushroom. And usually set them as a side or as a garnish so I can really appreciate them. And that really makes a huge difference on just your buttons and portobellos. I mean, again, cook them maybe how you normally do, which might just be a quick flash fry or something like you've always seen, as many people have. And then try what I just described just with your buttons, and there's a pretty big difference. Now, beyond that, I would say one of the most common at the store that is one of my favorite edibles is your classic oyster mushroom. It's popular because it's very easy to grow, but it's actually, in my opinion, if you cook it how I just described, to my palate, I mean, it's delicious. You really can't go wrong. And then certainly shiitake. Shiitake is also incredibly common, very easy to access. And I mean, again, cook it the same way. Shiitake and oysters, their stems are quite firm. And so a lot of people just cut those off and don't even cook them or eat them because they're really chewy, not as enjoyable. So it's more about the caps, but it depends on the age of the mushroom. When they're really young, the stem is doable. And or you might just prefer that. I'll usually save the stems, or the stalks rather, and either dry them, powder them, add them to like a soup base or a stock base, or just simmer them and make a tea, or again, like a soup base just through the simmering, because there's a lot of flavor and even some beneficial nutrients and bioactive compounds that come out through that simmering.
Nice. I'd sign me up. That all sounds great. So slime molds. Can you explain more about slime molds and how are they different from mushrooms and mycelium?
Well, I am not an mycologist or mycetologist, so that's where I have to draw the line. I know very little about slime molds. They were historically studied by mycologists until they were reclassified and shuffled away. So I've only given them the slightest opportunity in my time. Really the best thing I can point anybody towards is a pretty cool documentary called it escapes me, something garden, the Creeping Garden. That's what it is, the Creeping Garden. And there's a complimentary book with it. And that's, at least an introduction to it. I mean, I don't think there's very much on the internet. You might get short BBC clips and things like that, but I haven't studied it too hard. But that documentary does a pretty good job of kind of breaking down in its own way, artistic way, sort of why these things are unusual. They're just really poorly studied. I mean, I think there's very few people in the world really giving them any time. I believe in the University of Arkansas, there's a small sort of slime mold research center department. And I've talked to some of those professors just about their work briefly, but it's just kind of all where a lot of it's at is just trying to capture them from the environment and name them. And that's kind of where it's at, really beyond that. They're decomposers. They have really interesting growth habits, and the way they grow is definitely looks kind of like mycelium, but under a microscope, it's fundamentally different. They're fascinating, but not my strong suit.
Yeah, they are wild looking. When you stumble across one of them, I'm always sort of baffled by how big they can get. Crazy colors.
I mean, one of the most interesting things that I've learned about them is that, and this varies, there's several categories of slime molds, but a lot of them that usually kind of look like a small mushroom, what that is it's actually, they're all individual cells, and then they will communicate with each other and collaborate and form this metastructure that looks highly complex, highly organized, but it's only the ones that are sort of on the outer surface that essentially become hardened off and become spore-like structures that can then fly away and distribute, where all the other cells involved in that body essentially lose the lottery. And it's this big question in slime mold research about, how is that defined? Who wins the chance to become a spore and actually spread? Very different than mushrooms, which again, the mushroom is just condensed mycelium. It's the apple on this much larger tree. And so that mushroom might eventually just rot and fall over or get eaten, but it's had the chance to spread its spores. And even if it didn't, it can pop up another mushroom over here later on.
wild. I see a fun video game in the future for slime molds. How about this as a question? Do you see a day when mushrooms would work as a filter in landfills and rivers to clean our environment?
Well, we can hope for things like that. I mean, a big part of it is trying to stop the pollution at the point source. So that's easy to say. It's also kind of just easy to say, to hope to put the mycelium or fungus in some form, or a whole suite of bacteria and organisms working together as they do in nature into these really disturbed habitats and trying to get them to do all this hard work. It's certainly not impossible, but it's pretty implausible. I mean, you get such a complex mix of stuff inside of just a general landfill. You'd be better suited, at least as far as fungi are generally concerned, to separate everything out. So we'd have to dig everything up, sort it out better. And ideally, we would, in time, develop or find or discover or train or acclimate, or all of the above, different fungal species or varieties that are really well suited to eating this type of waste, and another one over here for this type of waste. And they've sort of, again, we've trained them or acclimated them to do that job really well. It's kind of a hard sell to say, one mushroom will be able to eat everything and kind of deal with it all. But again, this whole reality, this realization that fungi have these really unparalleled the degradation and digestion and oxidation mechanisms that we don't find anywhere else in plants, animals, and by and large bacteria, is something we've only looked at in recent years and in recent decades, and only in recent years started to really try to apply out in the field. There's been some pretty good success, definitely some failures. There's a lot more to learn, a lot more people need to get involved, but give it enough time. I mean, I'm sure what we learn tomorrow or the next year, what we learn tomorrow won't even help us predict what we learned the year after. I mean, it's like I say, it's sort of this unknown frontier, which is daunting, but also pretty exciting. And especially with obviously all the need for dealing with the pollution, whoever can help with that is welcomed and encouraged.
Sticking with that for a second, could you imagine a future where fungi are used to break down plastic to use in fuel or anything in that category?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a huge area of research right now. I mean, we're trying to look at it with at Mycocycle. It's one of the bigger ones. I mean, in college, one of my research projects was on fungi and plastics, and the reality is that we've known for a century, since fossil, petroleum-based plastics were invented, that fungi break them down. When the plastics were invented, they had to test their durability. So and this has been done many times over the decades, bury pieces of it in the ground for a year or two, dig it up and test its changes to its color, its tensile strength, and also culture its surface to see what's growing on it. And through all the studies, we typically find fungi in certain categories or genera of fungi prevailing, and some of our better chemists that are well known doing a really good job at it, and usually working in consortium. So again, it's not just one species doing all the work. They're kind of working in waves or sort of complementing each other with different skill sets, and bacteria are doing some stuff as well. And so a lot of the research you find with remediation and the plastic stuff is for simplicity's sake and for, science trying to reduce variables. We're just looking at one species, one plastic, and we do find some interesting results. But by and large, I believe in the future, it's going to be mimicking nature better, where it's either succession. So it's sort of this species, then this one, then this one, then this one in a sequence, or some sort of mixture of them that work well together. And there are examples of that, say with bacterial remediation. Bacteria are good at breaking down certain simple chemicals. And in some cases, they work better as, multiple mixed together. One of the more interesting examples is just a little bit of a curveball in the world of mycology that happened, almost 8 years ago now, so it's been a little while, was the accidental discovery of one of these endophytic fungi, again, the fungi that live inside of plants, having the innate ability to eat polyester polyurethane, a certain type of plastic researchers at Yale were looking at these endophytic fungi, just culturing plant tissue from the Amazon, seeing what fungi grew out of it, and saw one day that the fungus was eating the petri dish, the plastic petri dish. And so they set up a separate experiment and grew that fungus on that plastic, and were able to prove that it could do it as its only carbon source. So essentially its only energy source, and with or without external oxygen. So that was pretty exciting, but it's been a handful of years. It's not that all the polyester polyurethane has gone away yet, but that was a big insight into untapped, again, sort of this mastery of chemistry that fungi hold that we don't even know, and that was just some sort of random fungus out there, unexpectedly able to do that.
It's amazing all the things we discover, just a little bit of experimentation. So here's some questions about the health benefits, which you touched on a few times during your talk. Could you talk a little bit about the use of fungi in Chinese medicine?
Well, I mean, I'm not trained in traditional Chinese medicine, so I can only say so much. And of course, traditional Chinese medicine has a very different, a completely different paradigm to health than allopathic Western medicine. So it kind of depends on who you're talking to, whether it's a conversation that's easy to have or not. But what I can say is that certain mushrooms, I mean, a good number of mushrooms are heavily used in traditional Chinese medicine. There are several that are arguably some of the most commonly used. One that people might be familiar with in the West or in North America is reishi. So Ganoderma lucidum or Ganoderma resinaceum, in closely related species. And this is a mushroom. It's a beautiful red shelving conch, hard woody mushroom. Conch is a term we use for sort of these hard shelving mushrooms. And it's a chemical powerhouse. It produces hundreds of unique bioactive compounds. And it truly is this magical factory of medicine that has been termed historically the 10,000-year mushroom, the mushroom of immortality. And modern research is validating a lot of this through the isolation of some of these compounds and showing unique properties. Another very commonly applied, I think even the most commonly used, or one of the most alongside reishi, is what's known as fu ling, I believe, in Chinese. I more commonly know it as tuckahoe or Wolfporia extensa. It used to be known as Poria cocos. And it's this big, it's called a sclerotia. It basically looks like a coconut that grows off the side of a log, or a buried log is how we cultivate it. And it's actually not the mushroom. It's actually just a big condensed ball of hard mycelium that's used as nutrient storage. And yet this hard coconut-like thing of mycelium hosts unique compounds that is highly revered in Chinese medicine. And of course, in Chinese medicine, there's many preparations. It's all about not just the one ingredient, but how you formulate it and mix it with stuff. And again, there's these paradigms of different types of qi going on. So much bigger discussion than just the bioactive compounds. But again, the research of recent decades has really just been looking at especially at the start, the mushrooms that have been long used in the well-documented and rich in anecdotal evidence, traditional Chinese medicine, and the species that have been revered. And in some cases were only, reserved for the emperor and things, because either they were rare or their medicine was so great that, the lower classes couldn't even have the opportunity to try it out. So it's one of these debatable things. I find quite interesting that some people say that there are no there's no bioactive compounds in mushrooms, essentially saying there's no medicine in mushrooms. And there's lots of studies showing the other way around. So it's sometimes is an interesting debate, but for me, the research is very clear. We just, unfortunately, it's one of these classic things, like with natural herbs or natural medicine with herbs, is that for a lot of stuff to be proven and sort of get the stamp of approval from the FDA, it has to go through quite expensive and long-term peer-reviewed studies, double-blind studies. And that's a pretty big prohibition, especially when usually these natural medicines work as synergistic medicines, where it's not just one compound, but it's multiple compounds potentially all working together. And so you can't really isolate it either. So it's a catch-22. As with all alternative therapies, natural therapies, it's either for you or not your thing.
Thanks for that thoughtful answer. I think that kind of is a good segue actually to the next question. Can you comment on lion manes mushrooms and their role in preventing dementia?
Well, so
about that?
Yeah, so lion's mane is one of the more. There's a couple really well appreciated, especially in, trending into the allopathic world, where it's definitely getting a lot of recognition for its very unique compounds. So most notably for the chemists out there, the biologists, they're known as hericenones and arenacenes, and these are lipid-like structures. They're triterpenoids is the category they fall into, as many some of the more potent fungal medicines fall into, and they stimulate our body's innate production of what's called nerve growth factors. So they turn on our bodies, they enhance and sort of boost our body's natural ability to heal the nervous system. And so studies have shown their ability to help regenerate myelin, so the insulation around the neurons, and potentially help. The quote I usually fall back on is, it's the mushroom is nature's best natural cure for dementia. If we're going to try anything from nature, it would be this mushroom. And so there's definitely a lot of research, probably moving into the future. The compounds will be synthesized, as we find with psilocybin. A lot of studies nowadays with those isn't done with mushrooms, it's done with a synthetic form of the compound. And so that will probably be happening with hericenones and arenacenes, and for hopefully the world's benefit. Apparently I'm not a neurologist, but it's by and large has abilities and effects that have yet to be paralleled. One of the other really well-known ones, really well-respected compounds, is cordycepin, and that's produced by a completely different type of fungus, different mushroom. This one actually, so lion's mane grows out of dead wood. Cordyceps species that have cordycepin, they grow out of dead insects, and so it's a very different ecological role, but they produce this compound that has been shown, among many things, to increase your body's ATP, so your energy production, as well as increase your red blood cells' ability to carry oxygen. So they're definitely great for people, athletes, people needing more energy for whatever reason, chronic fatigue, old age, etc. And so this is another very, very popular, highly regarded, traditional longevity, live forever type of mushroom, as is the records show. And so those are definitely two mushrooms to look into, two compounds to look into if you want the harder research, and certainly worth standing behind and learning to grow. They're both really easy actually to grow nowadays.
Thanks. Can you talk about, expand on the use of fungi as a meat substitute, especially in frozen foods?
Well, there's been a fungal-derived protein food product called corn with a Q-U-O-R-N for decades. I've tried it. I mean, it's kind of like soy, like fake soy meat things. It's highly engineered, as those soy isolates are. So it's kind of up to you. If you're looking for a meat alternative, that already exists. Corn does exist. I've seen it now. It used to be more over in Europe and in the UK, and I've seen it in more recent years in the States. Yeah, that's one of the main ones. I mean, the shiitake is highly regarded as a potential good alternative to meats as well for, say, vegans. It does have all the essential amino acids. I'm not sure of the ratio, and so I'm not sure exactly how much you need to get all of what you might need in a day, but it has been shown to have all the essential amino acids. I believe it's shiitake as well, and some other mushrooms do this as well, but shiitake produces a unique amino acid that has its own health properties, sort of apart from just protein supplementation. Mushrooms in general are quite actually nutritious. They're sort of these superfoods. Depending on the species, oysters are a great example. They're 30% protein by dry weight. I mean, that's actually a lot more than quite a lot of other meat alternatives. But oysters, I don't believe, have all the essential amino acids, but you get a lot of them. There are also mushrooms in general that are high in minerals because they absorb minerals from their food source, similar to how they work with heavy metals. But they also produce, to varying degrees, and depending on the species, vitamin C, K, A, not so much the B vitamins, but those other ones, and most notably vitamin D2. And this is actually due to the ergosterol that's in the cell wall of all fungal cells, essentially, being able to convert UV light into vitamin D2, similar to how our melanin works, but it's a different compound. And so there have been studies, and they've shown this, where you can take mushrooms, dried or fresh, put them in the sun. Usually the gills or the spore-bearing structure sun side up. and leave it for a few hours, and the vitamin D concentration will dramatically increase. So, I mean, they're nutrient dense in a lot of ways. It's part of the argument of why they can be so expensive if you wanted to try to make that argument. But I would just, as with anything with diet nutrition, I wouldn't, and I'm not a nutritionist either, wouldn't necessarily lean on the one thing as a solid meat alternative.
I missed part of a question going back a little bit when we had the line of questions around growing mushrooms, edible mushrooms in the garden. Someone asked, they have lots of mushrooms, likely unedible mushrooms growing in their wood chips. Is there a way to displace those with edible ones?
It'd be kind of a stretch. That mushroom has essentially already established, so its mycelium is kind of already there, has a good foothold, and might very well be a good defender. And so if you try to introduce, say, that garden giant mushroom I mentioned, even though that mushroom is really strong, it might not be able to fight off the existing mushroom. In nature, fungi are always defending their territory, their food. It's a fungi world out there. So same thing happens in the garden. You can certainly try, but I wouldn't throw all your mycelium into one wood chip basket. What you could try to do is just take a small pile of representative chips, and if you say get some of this garden giant spawn growing medium, mix a little of them together, do a little experiment, just a little mason jar, a little small bucket, and just see if the mushroom grows in that somewhat more controlled space. And if it does, great, because what you could do then is, it might be that if you put all of it right out to the wood chip path where maybe the sun is beaten down and it's a lot of other harsh environmental challenges it has to deal with along with fighting this existing mycelium, you remove it, you put it into the shade, maybe get a little bit of water, then the Stropharia that's the mushroom, the garden giant, has a better chance of fighting this existing mushroom. And you do, 10 of it works the first week, 1 bucket works, okay, do 10 buckets the next week. Then you got a bunch built up, sort of stocked up, and then you could go spread that around your garden. And so it's a little bit more of a baby stepping into it rather than, as I've done and many people I've seen do, sort of risk it all and sort of throw everything out there, do a big thing. It doesn't work, and you might actually get a little defeated and never want to try again because it didn't work. And so I certainly don't encourage that. Definitely it's, and a lot of the way that I do stuff nowadays before I do anything kind of new and big and flashy is just do a little small experiment, no stress, if it doesn't work.
Great. I've got 2 more questions. Can you talk to no-till gardens, which use of layers of wood chips and fungi-based environment to bring nutrients to food gardens?
Well, yeah, as with anybody's gardening, as the questioner might very well know, how you sort of determine a strategy based on the existing conditions. One of the things I've questioned and wondered about is this notion that, you'll come across in some alternative agricultural practices or regenerative agriculture, or people just trying to build their soil or bring biodiversity into their soils, like, oh, if you add more wood chips, you'll get more fungi. And that's based on some research. But my question with anything like that, or even there's other ways, sort of simpler rules of thumb, I guess you could say, that people fall back on when talking about fungi and soil, is my question is always, well, which fungi are we talking about? There's a lot of them, and which ones do we want? And some are, better at doing certain things than others. So one of the things I've come across and that I sort of don't fully understand is just, add wood chips, you'll get more fungi. I know that there's been studies showing that you'll get more mycelium and things, but is it the species you want? And is it ones that will do good benefit? It's kind of a crapshoot. Whereas if you maybe cultivate the species that have actually been well researched and intentionally bring those in instead of just hoping for the best, you might have a better chance. So examples of what I'm alluding to is there's a practice in what's known as Korean natural farming. It's sort of what's traditional Korean practices that have been westernized or brought to the West in just recent years. And there's many aspects to it. And one of them is essentially cultivating wild molds, meaning you would take traditionally a little cedar wooden box full of partially cooked rice, set it in a non-disturbed area, forest, what have you, and let the mold just grow on it. Whatever mold is there, grow on it for a few weeks. And then you bring that moldy rice back, do a series of dilution steps, and eventually mix all that collage of wild molds into your soil. And that's been shown to be quite successful. And there are some parameters. They're not usually identifying the species, but you're trying to not get the stinky ones. You're not trying to get the blue ones. You want the nice white ones, so there's a little bit of parameter, a little bit more control. And then similarly, but differently, there's a lot of research on a group of soil molds called the Trichoderma species. And they actually, they're some of the more common ones on your bread, and you'll see them all the time on all kinds of food. Not so pretty, but actually very well researched for their ability to protect plant roots from predator organisms, other fungi in the soil. They're sort of somewhat mycorrhizal and also somewhat defensive of their plant partners. Sort of fill a mycorrhizal role in the absence of mycorrhizal fungi, root associating fungi. You can also apply Trichoderma mold to your compost and speed up your compost pile. There's also a lot of research showing the same yeast that makes our beer and bread. That's pretty easy to cultivate. If you ever made sourdough, you could cultivate that thing up and put that into your soil. And that species, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, has been shown to be beneficial to plants. So I lean personally more towards the trying to bring in the right ones, or even in the Korean natural farming, it's still sort of wild, natural, and it's assembly of wild species. So you're not just, one species, silver bullet type approach. But at least it's a little bit more control instead. And you actually know you're doing something. You are bringing something instead of just throwing wood chips everywhere.
Great. So now that you've got all of these folks at home listening and super excited about mycology and foresting and exploring the world of mushrooms, how can the average mushroom hunter help contribute to the study of mycology? What kind of community science projects are out there that people can tap into?
Well, probably one of the most accessible, and for a lot of reasons, is getting involved. Well, either with your mycological society. So, at the base level, you're going to learn how to identify local fungi. You're going to meet other mushroom people and form some community, engage with your environment, all those good things. At the very least, you'll help sort of inherit this knowledge from the older folks and someday transmit it on. That's super important. But more beyond that, if you want to get more into the citizen science world of mycology, citizen mycology, that process has been formalized through the nonprofit I mentioned briefly during the slides of the Radical Mycology Convergence, which is the North American Mycoflora Project. They actually renamed just recently, so I don't actually know the new name, but it's a whole collection of the sort of mycological societies, the just wild mushroom foraging amateurs, if you will, paralleled or complemented with the academics and professionals and student researcher mycologists from across North America, working in collaboration also with outside funding and grants and things like that to help pay for not so much the just collecting mushrooms. You got to kind of do that on your own volunteer time, but you collect it, take very good notes. They have a whole clear protocol, take photos, upload the documentation online. Again, it's pretty step-by-step, but the big clincher is they have funding to pay for genetic sequencing. And what this helps with is you collect the mushroom, you take your notes and photos, and you send a piece of tissue to them, and they will genetically sequence it and apply that genetic code to all your data and photos. Over time, what this builds is a distribution map of fungi and a better sense of their fruiting patterns and where exactly the species that supposedly is only on the East Coast, but actually does show up in Montana, what is its actual distribution map? We really don't have that in any degree close to what we have with almost every plant in the world, or at least in North America, where especially like the invasives or even the common ones that are very well mapped. It's so hard with mushrooms because you can't just pick up some soil and just quickly test it and know all the fungi that are there. For mushrooms, you have to wait till they fruit, and they don't necessarily fruit every year or in the same place. So that, what we call them like a myco blitz, similar to a bio blitz. You might go out through Mycological Society, or if you're really avid, the organization might even pay individuals to go out, survey all the fungi in their environment on a given day, in a given season, a given year, document it all, and then again get the genetics applied to that, so that in time we just have better data. It's so fundamental, but really critical, because again, we don't know so much beyond that. That's, I guess, I like to think of mycology in some degree sort of not necessarily split, but balanced with these traditional approaches, traditional sort of more hard science of mycology, which is as a natural science fundamentally based on tracking the organisms, naming them, classifying them, figuring out their ecological roles. And then you have the applied mycology, and that's the cultivation, that's the integration of the fungi into your garden. All these other things I just so briefly touched on are just wide open arenas where, yes, we have pretty good practices today, but I would never say I or anybody knows it all, that we've done everything. Everything's sort of up in the air, or at least open to further experimentation. So it's really to the degree that anybody's interested, able, and willing to take on, getting creative, getting experimental, getting weird, whatever you want to do with fungi. Again, you're really welcomed and encouraged to do that in this science, more so I'd say than in a lot of other formal sciences, which is fun in its own way. And also just as you start to get into mycology, I mean, the fun is, you don't even need to question the fun. I mean, it's just there the whole time.
Thanks for that. And last question. Could you talk about fungi being used to combat invasive species like blackberries or Japanese knotweed? Oh, before you do that, sorry, Peter, I'll mention that Mel just dropped into the comments the organization's name that you were trying to come up with. It's now called the Fungal Diversity Survey. And the link is in the comments too. So yeah.
Undis, yeah. That's right. Yeah. So yeah, I actually knew somebody. Actually, it was back in college. One of my classmates was looking into this exact question, and there's been research into it, but I think it's fairly inconclusive, which is why you don't see it. I mean, obviously, if it worked well, you would hope there'd be commercial products. A way to compare that or to think about that is we have. So the cordyceps mushroom, one of these medicinals I mentioned, I said it grows out of dead insects. And so this is a category fungi known as entomopathogenic, so insect attacking fungi. And there's many of them. They actually are really important to keeping insect populations in balance all around the world. And decades ago, researchers started saying, well, hey, couldn't we harvest these fungi, essentially spray them onto plants attacked by aphids, and boom, deal with the aphids. And after decades of research, there are some instances where the commercial products that have been out there for a long time do work. It's usually only with certain crops, certain greenhouse conditions, and it's quite tricky. But that does exist. With the endophytic fungi, the fungi that live inside of plants, that's been more of a recent research or area of research. Endophytic fungi are one of our really, really big question marks. We don't know how many are out there. It's part of the reason our numbers of fungi are so large. We have no idea how many fungi fill plants, let alone their chemical possibilities, et cetera. In the wild, they seem to be defending plants and in various ways warding off insects. An insect might actually bite a plant, and then inside that plant was an entomopathogenic fungus, and the insect bites it. The fungus goes into the insect flies away, and later is infected by that attacking fungus. So these are sort of how fungi can move around in one example. So the obvious question is, well, hey, couldn't we harvest some of those helpful fungi, spray them on the plant? The fungus would grow on the surface, grow into between the plant cells, enter the stomata or what have you, take root, and then be doing its natural job. And there is research going into that. And there's not just for that example, for defense against pests, but other benefits to the plant. My big question, my bigger kind of concern, or a little bit of a yellow and or red flag, is how will that affect the natural community of these internal fungi that we know so little about? And are we going to cause a long-term problem by sort of pushing in a strong one to the, while pushing out a bunch of other, lesser known ones? So I lean away from that, even though it's quite appealing. But that's my opinion, and certainly people and companies are looking into that. It's something you can do. I mean, these types of things can be done. I mean, there are practices in natural farming called foliar sprays, where you basically harvest wild organisms. There's many different practices. You essentially make a brew of bacteria and wild fungi and things, and you just spray it on your plant leaves. And there's a lot of research showing that definitely helps by protecting the plants. And those are more coating the surface of the leaves, maybe not so much going endophytic, growing into the plant. So those are kind of two different techniques and something to look into.
That's great.
If that's new to you. Yeah.
Well, that's our time. Peter, thank you so much for sharing what's clearly a great passion of yours and infinite amounts of information and knowledge. Really appreciate the talk you've given this evening.
My pleasure.
And I hope that everyone at home enjoyed tonight's event. If you would like to watch the video and share with friends or watch it again, you can check out the videos that in our section on OMSI's Facebook page, as well as our YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates on events and inspiring content from OMSI. And I know I mentioned at the beginning, but please consider supporting Science Pub and making a donation via the Facebook button, or you can visit omsi.edu/donate to make a contribution. Join us next Monday, October 26th, for a lecture by Dr. Tian Tian Yu. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Physics in the Institute of Fundamental Science at the University of Oregon. And she's going to present evidence for the existence of dark matter, describe a few methods for searching for dark matter, and tell us about the latest research used in the search. Once again, thank you so much to our partner Cellstream for making tonight's event possible. As always, we can get more information at our website, omsi.edu. And thanks and have a great night.